Hi, I'm Lynn Ehrenberg, and I'm here with Tadeous Lepa,
Correct.
and he's our author of the day. So we are going to be interviewing him on our podcast. So if you do plan to read this book, which we hope you will, you might want to stop now and come back because we're going to be a spoiler alert, right?
Yes.
So where can they get this book?
It's available on Amazon
Okay.
and also Barnes & Noble. You can purchase it through them.
Okay, limited duty. So I say we just jump right in.
Sounds good to me.
I very much enjoyed this book.
I'm glad.
And I have dealt with a lot of authors and self-published authors and in my public relations career and the book club. And everyone thinks their books are great and then they're not really. But yours, I just really want you to know that it really resonated with me.
Well, thank you.
And I would love for you to share with our viewers, and you know, I personally have a lot of questions in here. What prompted you to write this book?
Well, my father was getting up in age. He was in his late 80s, and I didn't know much about himself or his World War II experiences. And so I felt that I would chronicle his experiences so that I would have a history that I could pass on to, his grandkids and anybody else. And so I sat down with my dad. I did 16 hours worth of recordings, and I started developing it, putting things in chronological order, doing research. And it started to dawn on me that, geez, this is a little bit more involved than I expected. And as I had stated before, I had gone to a writer's conference, met with a best-selling author who critiqued my manuscript and came back and said, hey, you have a wonderful storyline, but you need to focus on your father a little bit more so that we can understand the person he was and why he did what he did. So that was the whole premise behind me writing. I didn't start out wanting to be a writer, an author of a book. It just kind of fell into place that way.
And when I was reading it and learning about, I don't even know your father, but when he was a kid and his sister and all the backstory, and I found myself so interested in it, and I was like, wow, okay, well, Wayne really knows what he's talking about when he recommends a book. So let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
So take us back. Your father, it takes place, you give the backstory, which is super interesting. Your father and his eye. Let's talk about the eye.
Okay, my father he grew up on a farm in Michigan, just outside the Detroit area. And one day, him and his sister were being watched by an older relative, a 12-year-old. And this 12-year-old, his position was to break up the coal from the coal bin so they could put it into the furnace. And my aunt and my father were sitting in the coal bin, and she was around 5 years of age, he was 2, and they were, jockeying for position. And my aunt asked my father, hey, you're sitting on a larger piece of coal than I am, let's switch places. They did, and just at that moment, the relative was breaking the coal, and a shard of the coal struck my father in his right eye, and he lost to the eye.
Was that the cousin?
Yes, that was
Walter?
the cousin, Walter.
And he never held him?
No.
Held it against him or anything? And how old was your father, your sister?
He had just turned 2, because this happened in 1922. He said it was October of 1922. My father was born in September, so he had just turned 2 years old.
Right, which I think sets the tone from the beginning about the character of your father. Like, he didn't blame anyone around him.
No.
He didn't look at it as a handicap. No. He got an eye, and it looked just like every other eye, right?
Yes. Yeah. The first 3 years after the eye had been removed, he wore a patch.
Yeah. And
then my grandfather worked at Ford Motor Company at the Rouge plant, the steel plant, and he spent $12.50 on an artificial eye, which, when you think about it, my grandfather was making $5 a week, so it was 2.5 weeks worth of pay to get an artificial eye. Which you think about it now, it's like $12.50 is nothing, but back then that was a lot of money. And my grandfather wanted to make sure his son looked normal.
Yes, I know your grandfather. I would have liked to know more about your grandfather too, but we didn't have time, I guess,
Yeah.
go that far back. But
Yeah.
you did start with him, and I was thinking, oh, this is a really great family. Was your aunt the one? So she went to the fancy school.
Yes, yes. She did not like living on a farm, and so she took a job during the summer as a nanny in the Detroit area, working for wealthier families. And she was able to start going to a private school, and she did not.
I thought she was cool too.
Yeah,
I liked her character.
Yeah, she always had that flair about her. And then everybody had everybody had a dog, and she wanted to have a dog, and she wanted a poodle. And somebody gave her this little puppy, and she named it Fuzzy because it was just a little fur ball. And as it grew, she realized it wasn't a poodle, and she wanted nothing to do with it, and it became my father's dog.
Fuzzy.
Fuzzy.
That was so cute. That was really, really cute. So then we move along. Your dad's growing up. He is part of he started driving a car
At 8.
At 8.
At the age of 8, he was driving on the farm to help with the chores. When you would bale hay, and you'd have to put it on the back of a truck. Well, my grandfather, he was strong enough to throw the bales onto the truck. An 8-year-old couldn't, but he needed somebody to drive the truck, so my father had to learn how to drive. And also being on the farm, my grandfather worked the second shift, so he worked somewhere between like 2 o'clock in the afternoon to midnight, and the produce had to get to the market early on Saturday mornings, so he had my father load up the truck with the produce and drive into Detroit to the it was farmers market. And
Got pulled over.
he got pulled over one night.
That was scary.
He had been doing it for.
It made me nervous.
And this police officer stops him and asks for his license, and my father tells him, "I don't have one." And he says, "Well, you can't drive in the city of Detroit," so he had to turn around and go back home. And you think about it now, you have an 8-year-old driving a car, the police officer doesn't ask anything about why he's doing it or what he's doing, he just wants to know if he has a license. So that's, shows you the difference in the thinking back then.
Well, what about the part where the police officers then decided to give him a driver's license?
Right,
But they were so impressed with his ability. If he could back it up or do something with the car?
he had to. It happened the very next day. It happened on a Friday night. Saturday, my grandfather, he comes home from work, sees that the truck is filled with produce, and my dad isn't around, or is still at home. And he asks what happened, and my dad tells him the story, and he says, "Come on, we got to go to the farmer's market, and after that we're going to go get you a license." So they go to the police department afterwards, and my grandfather asks, "What do I have to do to get a license?" And they said, "Well, who do you need a license for?" And he says, "For my son." And they looked at my dad and they said, "We've never given a license to someone so young, and we don't really have a test." So one of the police officers made, I don't know if it was just a kind of a callous remark, but he said, "Well, if he can turn over the crank on a Model T Ford, we'll give him a license." So this is something my father had been doing for several months, or if not longer. They went down, my dad put the crank in, and he turned it over. The car started running, and they looked and they said, "Well, he's man enough to start a car. He's man enough to drive." So that was my father's driver's test, and that's how he got his license.
That's amazing.
And he drove for 88 years until he was 96.
Wow. Was this also around the time, what did he do did his mother, your grandmother, tell him to go get some food, and he went and did he shoot something?
It was.
I was impressed with that part too.
Yeah, this was right. Depression era type of thing. I mean, early in the say late 1920s, they were living on the farm. They did not have any food. It was in the fall.
How old was he around this time?
He was probably about 7 or 8 years old as well.
Around the time. Okay.
Say 7 or 8, 9, somewhere in there.
Gosh.
And she said, "We have no food, or we're hungry." And so my dad, she said, "Go out and see if you can find something." And so my dad went out and he saw a rabbit.
Oh, rabbit.
Yes,
Right.
and he also, some along the line, he found a Coke bottle, an empty Coke bottle. and that was his weapon. And he got close enough to the rabbit where he threw the Coke bottle and hit the rabbit, and he thought he had killed it. So he brings this rabbit home.
Oh, right.
He brings the rabbit home, gives it to his mother. They string it up. My grandmother is getting ready to butcher it and take the skin off. She puts the knife to the skin, and the rabbit starts to squeal and move around. And she screams. So my dad has to take the rabbit, and he has to kill it. And so that was it. But he did what he had to do.
And I think as an author, you did a really fine job at describing it. And I felt like I was in it. I was like, oh no. And it's like squealing. And then she's like, and then you're still impressed with this kid who went out there and actually found a rabbit to do this, did exactly as his mother said.
Yeah.
And then grandma's like, okay, time to skin it. And then I was like, what is happening here? It was very interesting.
Yeah. Well, again, when you're living on the farm, you're more self-reliant, and you didn't go to the store to buy meat. I mean, growing up, they butchered hogs, cows, chickens. So
was your aunt, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but was she older than your dad?
Yes, she's 3 years older than my father.
So is she around, I can understand why she's like, see ya.
Yeah.
I'm going to go off to private school, like in the city.
Yeah, that's why she did not like, my dad said she did not like farm, she had chores to do, and she just refused to do them. And if, you had to help out on the farm, and that was not something she really cared to do. And
did she, where did she live the rest of her life?
Well, she married very well. She married a prominent psychiatrist and grew up in a moneyed lifestyle. She became.
To which she was accustomed.
Yes, in the custom.
The path she was on.
Yes, and so she ended up where she. After my uncle had passed away, she ended up moving to Scottsdale, Arizona, and that's where she was until she passed away in 2008 or 2009.
Oh,
So,
okay. She was an interesting character. Every
Yes.
single person in the family, that's what I'm saying. I got caught up at the beginning. I was like, this is amazing. So then your dad's growing up, and then football. Football in college, I have a lot of underlines around here. His priest with the football,
Yes.
his advisor, I really liked him.
His name was, Father Harris was the priest at the school and was the athletic director. And my father, when he was 15 years old, he saw an ad to try out for a semi-pro football team in the Detroit area. And again, he was 15 years old, and all he ever played was sandlot. He did not play any organized. And he made the team. And they were paying $5 a game.
This was pro.
It was pro football because you were getting paid.
Right. So I was a cheerleader for the Dolphins like many moons ago. And when I was reading this, I was like, oh, this is giving some backstory on the NFL, the pro football. I was like, okay, college was more important then.
Correct.
But you get paid in the pros. So your dad was like, yeah, I get paid to do this. And his parents were like, why is he getting paid to do this? But
well, they didn't even know they didn't know what he was doing. He kept his athletic playing a secret. And so when he was playing football, and one of his buddies from high school, the high school where my dad attended was a very good school, and they were doing very well football-wise. They were coached by a gentleman who was a college All-American at one time. And so anyway, this friend of my father said, you couldn't make the team.
That's right.
And my dad says, the day I can't make the team is the day I'll give up the sport. So he bet $5 to his friend after playing one season of semi-pro. He said, I'll try out for the team. And he goes out the first day of practice. The coach looks at him, and my father was not very big.
And they didn't give him the right equipment.
That's right. They did not. And my father said he was used to having new equipment, new helmet, shoulder pads, everything. And so he goes out to practice, and they used to hang a dummy, a tackling dummy, from the crossbar of the goalpost. And he says there was one man who could hit the dummy, and it could spin all the way around the goalpost. Mm-hmm. And so my father lines up, he runs, hits this thing, and it spins around. And the coach stops practice and comes over to my father and says, "That's great. I can't believe you did that." Touches my father on the shoulder and realizes he's not wearing any equipment. And he says,
wasn't your dad like, if I have to wear that, I don't want to wear any of it?
Yeah, that was it.
It was cool.
Yeah, he says, it wasn't worth it to him. And the coach told him, he said, don't you ever come out here without the proper equipment. And he says the next day he got all new equipment. So he goes through all practice, and this is back when you had to make the team. It wasn't just, when you're in high school.
This is like what year?
This would have been 1936.
1936, okay.
And so he's there, he makes the team, and after he wins his bet, he turns in all his equipment to the coach and says, I only came out here for a bet. He says, I'm going to go back and play for the team was Garden City. He says, I'm going to go play semi-pro for Garden City because I ain't getting paid. Well, the athletic...
Father Harris?
Father Harris.
He was such a good role in this too, Father Harris.
Yeah.
Explain to him why it was important for him to stay in high school football.
He speaking with the coach and the athletic director, they both impressed upon my father, the semi-pro stuff is good for now, but you have a future, and you're not gonna make life with $5. If you go to college, and they felt that he had the ability to go to college.
Yeah.
So he had to repay all the money that he had made because to regain his amateur status.
Oh.
So he had to repay all that money, and then he was able to play high school football, and he excelled during that. And then his senior year, he won what is known as the Ross Trophy, which was given to the outstanding football player in the city of Detroit, and my father was the first lineman to ever have won the award.
Wow. Did you play football?
Yes, I did. Yes.
Nice.
Yes.
So I think that all of the backstory in this kind of sets you up for like understanding where your dad came from and maybe perhaps like why he was such a good dad and had such great character. I mean, how can you not when he's like 8 and he has a driver's license and then he's the baddest, coolest football player around, and then people want to pay him, and he was just amazing. I'm like, this person, it sounded, and he was just like his work ethic, and like you think his parents were so interesting because of the way they expected him just to get to work, and he did, and he excelled. I have this underlined. Okay, so when he's about to sign up to go off to war, the Marines, okay, my girlfriend Shannon, she dated a Navy SEAL.
Okay.
And then I remember we were out, this is like a long time ago. She's married now. But she was dating Navy SEAL, and then she thought the SEALs were up here and Marines were here, but they thought they were the toughest and the coolest, and then she ranked them. I'm like, what's going on? I remember she told a Marine out one night, she's like, you guys just think you're tough, and you got all defensive. But I read in your book, the Marines were my second choice. I thought that I would make a good Marine. They had the reputation of being the toughest.
Yes.
So what happened? Because he ended up, was it this due to his eye, or what happened?
Well, he at first he wanted to be a pilot, and the Army Air Corps was a precursor to the Air Force, and they rejected him because they knew he had only one eye, and so they said, we can't accept you. So he says he didn't want to do the Navy because he said if he put his head underwater, it would infect his eye, so that was kind of a no-go. So he said, I don't want the Army, I want the toughest, I want to be the best. So he went down to the recruiting office for the Marines, and they're going through his physical, and everything's fine. Now you have to understand, by this point, he had already been playing college football, so he's in great shape, he's a healthy, vibrant young man, and they go for the eye test. And my father notices that the gentleman who was administering the eye test for the eye chart never looked at the person he would just say, read line, whatever, and they would read it. But they would say, cover your right eye with your right hand and read, and then cover your left eye with your left hand. Well, all my father did was he covered his right eye with his right hand, which was fine because his left eye is his good eye. And then when they said, cover your left eye, all he did was took his left hand, covered his right eye again, and read the chart again correctly. And they passed him, so he gets 20/20 vision. They move him to the next station, which is where they have to dilate your pupils. And of course, the doctor looks into his left eye, the pupil dilates, no problem. He flash the light into his right eye, and the pupil doesn't dilate; it just shines back. And the doctor looked around, and like, what is going on?
Yeah, he got annoyed. Why did he get so annoyed?
Well,
it's his people.
Yeah, he wanted to know why he thought my dad was trying to play a trick on them and all that. No, my dad was just trying to get in.
Yeah, you're welcome. Like, he wanted to be there so badly. Like, I was like, that guy needs to relax.
Yeah, and he got so upset, and he just berated my father, and my father finally looked at him and he said, well, am I in or not? And he said no. And he says, well, then I don't have to put up with your crap. And he left. And that was it. That was his thing. And then several weeks later, he received a letter from the United States Army that he had been drafted into the Army. And he had been given the designation limited duty, which meant that he was not permitted to carry a firearm of any kind.
Hence the name of the book.
Hence the name of the book, right. And since I found out, there's actually one gentleman who was limited duty who won several medals because he became a medic. He had lost, he also only had one eye, and he had an aptitude towards medicine, and he...
Did I read about him maybe?
I don't know. I literally just found out about it a couple of months ago. So, but most of the men who were limited duty ended up serving, the country stateside in various capacities.
Now, prior to interviewing your father, you had said that you envisioned him in a more traditional sense off at war, right?
Right. Yes. When you hear about, he's a war veteran, and growing up with World War II movies, and everybody in my neighborhood, their fathers all fought in World War II. I just figured, he did the same thing. And then, he's talking about his experience was based in Texas and in Arizona and California, and thinking, when did the Germans or the Japanese come there? And so that's when I started learning more about what my father was actually doing.
Right. Now, I was trying to understand as I was reading along, and he's getting labeled with the eye and getting turned down here or being put here. Do you think that he was being treated unfairly, or do you think that it's a rule or whatever system that makes sense?
It was a rule at the time, and it still is a rule, and I think they were doing it for his own safety.
Okay.
And I can understand that. The thing was, he wanted to prove his ability. He always said, I felt that I was just as good as the other guy. I didn't want to be considered handicapped or, disabled. And that's the way you were treated. He said even in the Army, they didn't consider you, or they considered you to be less of a soldier because of this.
So do you think something should change?
Yes, I think things have changed a bit with all that. The disability part, though, I can understand, because if you lose half your peripheral vision, that's
Because in
definitely.
football that happened to him too. Remember, they put him in the wrong spot.
They put him in the wrong, and he was getting run over, and so he understood that. But he thought, I've got a good eye, I can shoot.
Right.
And he was a marksman. He earned his marksman degree, and the thing was, all these things he did to try to get his designation changed. They just kept turning him down, and then finally, a captain finally said, "Hey, I think I got a way to get you in a combat unit," and that was when they changed his designation for where he was training people with anti-aircraft. They made him a cook, which was, I really feel bad for the men who had to deal with my father.
Right, but it worked out okay, right?
Yes, it did.
It turned out to be fine.
Yes, and they luckily, when it came time to do the physical to go overseas, he got rejected, and he really said it saved his life because that group of men ended up fighting in the Battle of the Bulge.
Right.
And many of them did not come back.
Right.
So, yeah.
Is that when he was he dealing with the POWs at that point?
Yes.
Let's talk about the POWs.
Sure.
Because, okay, he's Polish, you're Polish.
Correct.
I did my 23andMe. I did know I was already Polish, but I learned more about my Polish heritage, so I found this particularly interesting. So I was underlying everything to do with Poland and background, and I thought it was so interesting, the dynamics, to have your dad's perspective of the German POWs versus the Polish POWs. Correct me if I'm wrong, the Germans kind of seem like nerdy, like, what's wrong with you guys? And then the Polish ones were traitors.
Yes.
So let's talk about that.
Well,
Tell us about the Polish.
When they right after the United States, the North Africa campaign, where the German POWs were coming into the country, and the bases were now needing to become a POW camp as well as a training facility. So they moved the German POWs into Camp Wallace, which is where he was stationed in Hitchcock, Texas. And my father, because he spoke Polish, and he had a little bit of German he could understand, he was very involved with the German POWs, because some of them started to work for him. They were assigned duties to do maintenance because they had specific skills. Well,
but they weren't allowed to.
They weren't
allowed to do anything involving the fight that was going on, right?
Correct. They couldn't work on anything that used, it was artillery based. So they couldn't work on a tank, they couldn't work on a Jeep that had a machine gun attached. They could change brakes on a troop transport, but that was kind of it.
That was interesting. And
Yeah.
were they the same? Was it the Germans where your dad took the machine gun out and like scared him because he was trying to like do something in the yard?
Well, a friend of his, one of his friends was in the one of the turrets for the POW camp, and they noticed that the Germans, while they're playing soccer, would kick the ball closer and closer to the fence. And his buddy said, what they're doing is they're marking off how far the fence is, and if they're looking to escape. And he says, eventually they kick the ball very close to an area that was not permitted. And as the man went to retrieve the ball, this gentleman opened fire with a machine gun and just mowed it down, and he deflated the soccer ball. And he says this German jumped into the barbed wire to prevent from getting hit. And so that was one of the things that they did. And I'm not saying it was the right thing to do.
I like it. I liked it. It was one of my favorite parts. I was like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Tell me more about what's going on. Because it's like the scene, like, what's good. Don't try to escape. You're not going anywhere. Get it. And the fact that they were so calm about it, they're like, look at these guys. That's what they're doing. They knew what they were doing, and then they handled it. And then the Germans, you said at one point they were like believing the propaganda and believing it, like really like proud, and over time they kind of...
Yeah, they said that my father became very friendly with the gentleman whose name was Fritz.
Fritz,
and
right.
Fritz claimed that I could never verify that he was the chauffeur to Rommel in North Africa. Now, I did go through and I saw a bunch of photographs in doing my research of Rommel, with the chauffeur. I asked my dad, does this look like Fritz? And he said no. And so I can't verify if that is true or not. But Fritz spoke enough English.
Why did he lie, though? What do you think just to be cool?
Just to be cool, probably. Yeah,
What's your gut tell you?
I don't think he was.
You don't?
He might have driven Rommel once.
Right.
or he was in that type of a thing. But whatever it was, he decided to tell that story. And Fritz would always tell my father, the Americans have no chance because the Germans were better fighters. They had, they were better equipped. Everything was better. And, we will destroy you. And that's the way it was. And it wasn't until after D-Day and the German soldiers started receiving letters from home that said, our homes are being bombed now, and this is what's happening. And that's when it started to sink in, we are losing.
Right, because prior to that even, they couldn't get the mail to them, right? Because
Correct.
It would be open and the Germans wouldn't let them communicate.
Correct, yeah, everything was censored.
But for this Fritz character, even though he was like, we're the best, your dad still liked him, right? They were they got along.
Right.
Your dad didn't like. Let's talk about the Polish POWs.
Yeah.
Because your dad's Polish.
He spoke fluent Polish.
Currently, at the time.
Yes, we still have family in Poland. And one day he was walking past a group of German POWs, and they were people who were working in the combined maintenance unit. They were employed, and he heard these POWs talking, and he realized they weren't speaking German, they were speaking Polish. So my father turned around and engaged them in a conversation. These POWs were absolutely alarmed that, oh my God, this person knows what we're saying.
Right. Actually, let me say, quote, what the hell were you doing in the German army? End quote.
Yeah.
I was angry and started calling them traitors since I knew that Germany had invaded Poland and had murdered many Poles.
Correct.
Powerful.
Yes. So he let them know, and they gave their excuse, but he still just, he let them have it.
What were they supposed to do? So I was reading this and I understood, and I liked how he held such a firm line and he maintained it the whole time. Mm-hmm. But didn't the Germans take them over and make them do that, or no? Like, what else? Did they have a choice?
Well, yeah, that was the thing. They said that they wanted to eat and they wanted to live. If it was either you join us or you die, kind of a deal. And my father, being very proud American, he said, I would have rather died than fought for the Germans.
What if they join the Germans, but then they secretly are fighting for the good
That would
guys.
be great. That would be great.
Like, you know?
But here they are. They're POWs, and if they were fighting against the Germans, they weren't doing a very good job.
Right.
You know? Because you think they would have surrendered and said, "Hey, we're Polish," but they never. They were German. You know, they were part of the German army, and they never broke ranks.
Oh, right. They could have, like...
I guess you could have come and said, "Hey, listen, we were Polish citizens. We were, brought into the army because we had no choice." That they still might have been, taken prisoner, or they would have been taken prisoner. But I think they might have been treated a little bit differently. They wouldn't have had the same treatment as the regular German POWs. But again, they just threw them all together in one big, group, and said, "This is who you're German POWs. We don't care where you're from or who you're with."
Right.
And so.
See, I think working with POWs would be fascinating. Even Guantanamo Bay, and I would want to just waterboard everybody. I know you're not supposed to say that, but I totally would. So I was very into the POW stuff. It's so bad. I think
Yes.
he didn't. Oh, Italian POWs. I'm also Italian.
Okay.
Let's talk about them.
Yes, my
The
father.
stark contrast.
Yes, my father. One thing he noticed, he dealt with the German POWs at Camp Wallace, and then later in the war, he was transferred to Fort Bliss, which is in El Paso, Texas, and they had a mixture of Italian and German. And one thing he knew about the Germans, they were very neat and tidy, very organized, and the Italians didn't care. They just, and the fact was, Italy fell before Germany, and the government, for whatever reason, said they're not really threats, these Italian POWs, and they were allowed to leave the POW camps to go out.
Because no one was scared of them?
They were considered no longer a threat.
Oh.
And he said, you could tell that they didn't care. They were happy that they weren't fighting. But they knew,
Right.
because they spoke Italian and it was close enough to Spanish, they would go out and date these Mexican, Hispanic ladies in Texas, and the German POWs were upset, and the Italians.
They were?
Yeah, because they couldn't go out because we were still fighting the Germans. Italy had already
And the
surrendered.
Italians, they just let.
Yeah, they just they kind of let it
And
go.
they were happy. It says here, they were safe, getting fed 3 meals a day, and had a place to sleep.
That's right. That's all they cared about.
The Germans didn't. See, that made the Germans. I was like, oh, well, the Germans. You shouldn't want to be a POW. You should
No.
You should want to not be a prisoner.
Correct.
So the Italians are just like relaxing and happy. They don't have to work and like with the Mexican ladies. And the Germans are discontent being there. I thought.
Yeah, they wanted to still fight.
Well, I was like, I felt like the Italians, like, that's kind of weak, isn't it? Like, well, you shouldn't be like, I don't know. Then at this point, I'm like, oh, okay, each group, this is getting interesting. So then it goes into we already talked about I have this underline and starred. Notice my star. You can't make that up.
No.
I have it starred. Then, Fritz, all the stuff with Fritz. And it's, look at
Yeah,
this.
dog
Did I
ears.
love
Yes.
this part?
Yes.
In reality, even if a family had been affected by the bombing raids, Nazi mail censors, we talked about that, the German POWs. Oh, the Russians. Let's just touch on the Russians. He hated, Fritz. I ran into Fritz after he had received a letter from a family member telling them about the Russian army overrunning his village. He hated the Russians. Surrendering to the U.S. Army was bad enough, but surrendering to the Russians was inconceivable.
Yes. You have to understand, with the thing that was happening in World War II, Russia started out with, as an ally to Germany, then Hitler switched up, and the Germans were brutal to the Russians. And when things had changed, they had, I think they said somewhere along, there were 5 million German POWs that were never accounted for after the war. They knew they were in Russia. They never were returned. They literally died in slave labor camps. That's how much the Russians hated the Germans. They were not going to let these people go. They were going to make them pay for that. So that's why the German prisoners knew it would be better to surrender to the Americans than to surrender to the Russians. If we surrender to the Russians, we have a good chance of dying.
Isn't it so bad? I'm going to admit this. Like, my mom and dad have called me a warmonger, but I think there's something good about that. It's like, don't mess with us.
That's
So bad. I know it's bad.
No.
But, like, I went to, when I was a cheerleader, we visited Fort Lewis in Seattle, I think. It's outside, it's like in Seattle. And we did a simulation
Mm-hmm.
with guns and Iraq footage, and we're like trying to shoot, and I'm next to a soldier,
Right.
and I was like trying to do the thing, and the guy in charge is like, ladies, you're gonna get shot because we're about to get killed by somebody up here. And I was like, and there were civilians walking out. I'm like, I should take them down because I'm gonna get killed. And my soldier was like, didn't want to say anything, but he was like, yeah, you know,
Yeah,
I can't say anything.
We try to
about
avoid civilian
that.
casualties.
I was like,
yes.
oh, meanwhile, I'm gonna. This really hit me hard. Anyway, that was my football and my war stuff. But let's take it now. Post, when it basically wraps up, right at the end, when what happens. Let's talk about what. See right here. Let's talk about when the war is ending and what happens.
Well, he's stationed at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, and he literally has nothing to do. The things that he was doing before, the training and all that, was no longer needed because we had, it was inevitable. And so he was bored, and he just wanted to go home, but they weren't going to release him. And so he started doing things. He took a job on the base in the officers club, and the officers would have to bring in their own booze. That was the thing. And all you could do, he could serve them a mixer. And he says he would pour the drinks, and he would pour them strong, and the officers would get drunk, and then they would end up leaving, and they would still have maybe a half a bottle of whiskey or whatever it was, and my dad would take it home with him.
Yeah.
so he had all this booze left over, and he kept it in his foot locker. And then when the Japanese finally did surrender, he opened it up, and they just the people on the base, they had a bit of a party. But when he wanted to get out as quick as he could, and so he was discharged January 31st of 1946. And he, you're waiting. Yes, you're waiting for your orders to leave. They're going to put you on a train to head back home. And one of my dad's buddies says, "Hey, I think I got a way to get on this train." He knows an MP, and they said, "Okay." So they go to the train station in El Paso, and the MP tells them, "When I open the door, just push your way in. Don't do anything else. Just push your way in." Well, my father and his buddy, they were in between the cars, literally. There were 10 people in this little cramped quarter because there was no room inside the cars. And again, this is in late January, early February now, and they're heading north. So the further north they go, the colder it's getting, and they're still outside.
Right.
And my dad took a fifth of whiskey with him. His buddy took a fifth of whiskey, and that was what they were going to use to keep themselves warm. And he says it wasn't until they got to Kansas City, I believe, where it was a big train station, and there was a hub that they were able to get off and find a seat inside the car.
Yeah.
And that eventually took them to Chicago. And when they came to Chicago, one of my father's very close friends, his name was Norb Witaski. Norb's family was very wealthy and owned 5 hotels in Chicago. And Norb had married Amelia Earhart's niece. Her name was Jackie. And I actually got to speak with their daughter when I was doing research on the book. I actually found her. And it was very interesting. But my dad gets to Chicago and calls up his friend he had been wounded in the war, and so he was sent stateside. And he says, "Hey, I need a place to stay." And they said, "We'll put you up in one of our hotels. Everything's complimentary." So him and his buddy spent 3 or 4 nights in Chicago just having a great time and enjoying each other. And then finally, when that ended, he says it's time to go home. He says he got on a train and went back to Detroit. And that was it.
That's amazing.
Yes.
I skipped over his tattoo.
Oh.
That was interesting. So now, where was it?
Well, we can go back.
It?
Well, Camp Wallace was originally a naval base. And then when the war started, they needed training centers for the Army. So they switched it from a naval base to a Army base. And then in 1944, around April or May, they switched it back to a naval base. So they went from 13,000 Army people to 13,000 Navy personnel minus 33 Army people, my dad being one of the 33.
Right.
So he's surrounded by Navy men. So, and they could not do anything. They couldn't go to they weren't allowed to go to to have a drink at the bar because they were not Navy. And so
it was
he
like
says,
fraternity, like, it seemed
yes.
like.
And so he says you had to schmooze with the Navy people to get into if you wanted to drink. Well, he finally did that, and he always said, keep your mouth quiet. Well, he was drinking a little bit too much, got a little bit too much liquid courage, and the sailors were all showing their tattoos, and my dad made the remark that getting a tattoo was probably one of the stupidest things anybody could ever do. And so these 4 sailors grabbed my dad, and they told him, they said, Dogface, you're getting a tattoo tonight. So they drove down to Galveston, Texas, to a tattoo parlor, and they were going to have a huge mother tattooed onto his chest. And he said, no. He says, if you're going to give me a tattoo, he goes, it'll be one I want, and I'll tell them where to place it. So he ended up having a tattoo on his
name,
left
right?
arm with a name. And that was it.
I love that.
Yeah.
I was like, well, that's easy.
Yeah.
Put your name, great. But I felt like when I was reading it, I didn't know if they were like hazing him. I felt like it was almost a brotherhood. Like was it
Well,
a little?
there was some camaraderie up until the time my father decided to open his mouth and make the comment
Right.
about the tattoos. That I think they took offense to, and yeah, there was always, there's always some animosity between the service members. I understand that. Each one thinks they're the better.
Right.
So, my father making that comment about, tattoos, and tattoos primarily were associated with the Navy, and so they got my dad a tattoo. So, yeah, I guess
Did
it was
you
a bit of
wonder when you were growing up, like, why your dad had his name on his arm?
Yes, I mean, we would look at that, and I would just say, what did you do? And he's like, you don't want to know. And later on, he tells me what had transpired.
Do you think you learned throughout this process a lot that you didn't know? I would imagine yes or no.
What I learned about my father was why he acted the way he did, the way he raised us, my sisters and I. He was, he was in charge of a black unit in the Army, and he was from the North, and people made a lot of derogatory comments because he associated with them. But he was practicing, respecting a person for the content of their character and not the color of their skin long before Martin Luther King.
That was a very big part in the beginning.
Yes.
I think story that underscores what you're saying is the one when he stopped the car, the little black girl was in the cornfields, wasn't
Yes.
she? And she just was raped by...
Yes. She had been raped by several white men, and I was too young to, I was 9 years old at the time, and this girl was probably a good 5-6 years older than me. She was a teenager, and I didn't know but she was very disheveled.
Yeah.
And I remember taking her back home, my sisters and I, and I remember this young black girl walks into the house, and my mother is looking at her like, who are you? And my dad just says, Helen, call the sheriff. And he did that. And then it came out in the newspaper that what my father did, it was in the police blotter in our local newspaper. And my sisters and I were ridiculed, as was my father, for what he had done. And he actually confronted one of the men who, said something. And he says, if it was your daughter, would you question the person if they were black or white, if they were just helping? He says, I help somebody in need. I don't look at their color.
Right.
And so that was the teachable moment, and that's something that I really appreciate. My own wife is a woman of color.
Oh, wow.
She's black. And my father absolutely adored her. And my mother did as well. And my wife said the first time she met my parents, she was a little nervous. And she said, your dad just loved me for who I was. And I said, that's the way I was raised. So that was it.
So nice.
Yeah, it was a good.
I love your family.
Well, thank you.
I think
appreciate
everybody
it.
needs to read this book because it's really heartwarming, and informative. It's like historical,
Yes.
and you get a glimpse from somebody's perspective who really lived through it. I just really, really enjoyed it thoroughly.
Well, I'm glad you did. It makes me feel good because, again, I didn't say I wrote the world's best novel.
I think it's fantastic.
I didn't write Gone with the Wind. All I was doing was writing my dad's story, and I appreciate it. I thank
loved
you.
it.
I love hearing good, positive voice.
Where can everybody get this?
Again, it's on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. You can get it online.
Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Okay.
Yes. And
Wonderful.
yes.
And I really hope you'll be writing another one.
Yes, I actually am. I'm in the process of working on another novel.
Can you
This
tell
one.
us about it?
Yes, I'm working. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was a very interesting character. Her name was Sophie, and she came to this country in 1923 with my mother. They escaped Poland after the World War I. But my grandmother, when she was 12 years old, her family were the horse breeders for the Polish government. My grandmother's family was very well off. And I went to Poland in 1992, and I got to meet a lot of my relatives. And I saw pictures that I had never seen. But my grandmother had a horse that she was very attached to. And when World War I started, all the horses were commissioned to the army. And so she had to give up her horse. Well, at one point in time, the battle lines kept switching, and she sees her horse. And so, as a 12-year-old girl, and what 12-year-olds are prone to do, she stole her horse back, and she hid in the forest near her home for 3 nights with the horse.
Oh.
And then she was caught, and she was sentenced to death by firing squad, and she talked her way out of it.
Wow.
Yeah, and so
What's the horse's name?
I couldn't tell you. I wish I knew.
So this is the story you're writing?
Yes, this is the story. It's my grandmother. It's
Oh my
about
gosh!
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so she
Wow,
was.
she must have been to talk herself out of being.
She should have been a lawyer.
Well, that sounds exciting. When do you think you'll be done with that? 'Cause we wanna have you
I
back.
would love. I'm hoping to get it done. I would like to get it done probably by May of next year.
Wonderful.
So I'm working on
Okay.
that.
Well, stay tuned because we'll definitely want you back. Thanks for coming on
Well,
again.
thank you.
It's limited duty, and you can buy it at Barnes & Noble or Amazon, and
Correct.
I highly, highly recommend it.
Yes, it comes in ebook form as well. So
Wonderful.
okay. Well, thank you
Thank
again,
you.
Lynn.
Of course.